Do you think that that is something that agencies can play a role in when it comes to cutting back on the number of hours that these people are working, or an officer, a deputy is working in extra duties, as far as putting a cap on that?
There are a lot of agencies that do put caps on the amount of extra duty that particular officers can work. So, for example, they might have a rule of no more than X hours in a 24-hour period, or no more than Y hours in a 7-day period, or something like that. Typically, that's not the genesis of those rules is not so much to help the officers make wise life choices, but it's more to decrease the probability of issues occurring from fatigue. And this is very real. We've seen it in our business. Just a few weeks ago, we got a photograph sent to us from a construction firm of an officer sleeping in a cruiser. And, we found out he just worked a 10-hour shift and then went right to a 6-hour detail. And that 6 hour was a road job. You never know how long they're going to last. And that detail ended up going 12 hours, and he was exhausted. We've seen situations where officers worked an all night extra duty detail, got into a cruiser in the morning for their active duty shift, went around back and fell asleep in the cruiser. So a lot of times agencies will put in these rules to avoid problems like that and to avoid the fatigue issue. It's also good to have rules so that it forces officers to think, why am I doing this? If I'm trying to work more than the allotted hours, or the hours that my agency thinks is a reasonable amount of hours to work, am I really making the right trade-offs? And should I rethink how I'm spending my time?
And I've seen that too on both sides. I know in my experience, you talk about sleeping in cars and so forth. And as a supervisor at an agency, I've seen that happen. And unfortunately, there's a whole disciplinary process and so forth that goes with that. And I would think from a risk perspective that there can be liability to both the agency, who would allow an officer to work more than a number of hours, as well as to that officer themselves.
There is absolutely liability with that, and there's been, in the last year, there's been cases on the national news front that brought to the forefront the notion of how many hours officers are working active plus extra duty combined. So having some type of a risk reduction, both for the agency and the officer, and also for society in general, to make sure that officers aren't being overextended and therefore working whether active duty or extra duty or both when they're not alert, makes perfect sense. I mean, look at airlines, right? They have very strict laws around captains and how much they can fly and how much they can be in uniform. I mean, there's been studies that showed that in the world of policing, just putting on that uniform raises your blood pressure slightly. So if that uniform's on 85 hours a week, whether you're actively physically active, or whether you're sitting behind a desk, you have 85 hours a week of high blood pressure, or higher than you would normally have. So there's a consideration for that. So I do think that it makes sense for an agency and the officer to sort of think through how to reduce the risk of too much.
Yeah, and I think that's part of why I wanted to have this conversation, because it's such a big part of what impacts their personal lives. There's been several studies, like you said, recently, with even working more than 8 to 10 hour shifts. And I know a lot of law enforcement agencies have gone to the 12-hour shifts because the guys like them better. It gives them more days off. Theoretically, more days off. You're working the same number of hours, but you're getting more days of the week off. However, if you're doing 12-hour shifts coupled with extra duty assignments, coupled with a family, so forth, when are you sleeping? When are you having that downtime to decompress?
Yeah, exactly. And look, I don't want to go down too far of a negative path. There's some huge benefits to extra duty. We talked about the monetary benefit from the officer's perspective, and clearly that can become seductive, right? More money is better than less money. As Bruce Springsteen says, poor men want to be rich and rich men want to be kings, right? And that's just the nature of humans. So you do need to self-control a little bit. You need to sort of self-control that yin and yang, and sort of, where am I spending my time versus how much money do I want?